everybody. This presentation is focusing on critical reading and note-taking strategies, specifically moving from passive to active learning. What I mean by passive learning is that is when we're encountering a material and we're just taking it in. We're not necessarily thinking or responding to that material. We are just reading it or viewing it. Active learning, on the other hand, is active engagement with that material. What that means specifically is as we're reading or as we are viewing a lecture, we are specifically making responses or thinking about that material and responding accordingly. In this specific lecture, we're going to be talking about the purpose of note-taking, metacognition and note-taking, strategies for active learning and note-taking, and of course the critical reading process. So metacognition and note-taking is where we're really thinking about the purpose behind our note-taking. So considering what is metacognition? Metacognition, we can break that into meta and cognition as we start to really break down what that means. So if you think about meta, we can think about what other words begin in the same way. So the one that comes to mind first for me is a metaphor. So a metaphor is figurative language. It's when we are trying to say something by comparing two unlike things. So really, the purpose of that metaphor is to give the audience a specific understanding. And the audience has to think about it. They have to think about what is that message that we're presenting through that metaphor. Cognition, on the other hand, is our thinking process, right? So when we put metacognition together, metacognition really means that we're thinking about how we're thinking. We use metacognition in order to take notes and engage with that content. So we're not just taking notes, we're not just reading, but we're thinking about how we're taking those notes. We're thinking about how we are engaging with that content. This turns note-taking specifically into a process instead of a means to an end. So moving forward with that purpose, when we're thinking about how we're taking notes, this really focuses on creating learning opportunities through note-taking. And one way that we do that is we figure out, well, what is the purpose for the specific notes I'm taking now? Then we can think about other ways that we can engage and explore that material. For instance, when we're thinking about creating learning opportunities through note-taking, that could be how we respond. So responding specifically with our thoughts, our opinions, responding with comments. So if you think of commenting, presenting agreement or disagreement, presenting questions, or even presenting your own examples so that we can make our own connections specifically to that material, or even connections to other ideas or other concepts that we are familiar with. Once we've identified the purpose and how we want to engage with that material, then we have a number of different strategies that we can use for this active learning and note-taking. We really want to think about critical note-taking as a process, because that can really help us to figure out how we want to respond, and of course, figuring out what specific material we should even be focusing on. So the first step of this process is anticipating. So when we anticipate, we can really brainstorm ahead of time. We can think ahead of time about what we should be focusing on, or even what is the purpose of the material and how we need to be engaging with it. So one way that we can anticipate is we can refer to the course calendar for the daily agenda or title of the reading you are taking notes about. So when we're thinking of the daily agenda, the title of the reading, that really sets the tone. It really tells us, okay, this is what this is about, so I should take notes about this subject. And of course, with this as well, we can even see, oh, I already know a little about this, and you can brainstorm what you already know or what you're already familiar with about that topic. So looking at an example, we have a lecture title. This lecture is entitled Visual Arguments, How Do They Work to Appeal to Viewers? So if we're anticipating what we should take notes about this lecture or how we should take notes, we want to think about what are the keywords that stand out to you? What do the keywords in the title tell us about the information we should focus on? And of course, how can we engage with the content? So first, if we're focusing on that first question, what keywords stand out to you? We of course have visual arguments. So based on our writing modes, we know an argument is trying to persuade. And of course, visual, that means that it's not a written argument. That means that we can brainstorm and think about what visual arguments are we familiar with. For me specifically, when I think about visual arguments, I think about advertisements because I see them all the time. If you watch TV or if you scroll on the internet, there are always advertisements everywhere. So I can think about the advertisements that I have found most persuasive or the ones that I found to be even problematic. Thinking of other words, how do they work to appeal to viewers? The root of that is really how are viewers persuaded? Since appeals are at the root of persuasion, people are persuaded when we appeal to their emotions, their logic, or even if they find us to be credible. So now that really is giving me a guide. It's giving me a lot of examples that I can think about. So when I engage with the text, I already have those ready. Lastly, we have that how can we engage with the content? So thinking of this title, I know I can engage with the content with my own examples, that I've seen all the time, and then that can really help me understand the content. The next part of the critical note-taking process is taking notes. So we really want to have that written record of this basically conversation we're having with the material we're taking notes about. So one way that we're going to be doing this semester is through a critical note-taking worksheet. This worksheet specifically helps us to visualize and make the connections, and of course have that written record that we can use later when we get to discussions, and of course when we get to the essays we're going to be working on. So as you can see here with the critical note-taking worksheet, we have two different columns. The first column is where we have our responses, our comments, our questions, our examples, and our connections. And on the right column, we have our notes. So by separating them, we can really focus on identifying and showing visually what specific note you're taking and then what comment you had there, or what comment you're making about that note or about a specific quote if you want to use a quote. Moving towards critical reading strategies, there are of course a lot of them. So of course, if we think about reading should not just be taking in that information. If you are reading and not writing anything down or not making any type of annotations, then of course you're not truly engaging in critical reading. So thinking of critical reading as a process, we do have 3 steps. The first one being pre-reading, which is very similar to predicting, very similar to anticipating, which we talked about for note-taking. The second step is annotating, and our third step is responding or reflecting. Beginning with pre-reading is really looking for clues to identify what you should be focusing on. Because of course, for whatever reading that we're engaging in, we do have certain characteristics that are fairly universal for all reading types. For instance, most readings we have a title. The title is really important for pre-reading because with the title, it can tell us what the subject is. So what that reading specifically is about, and it also can tell us what the writing type is. So is it going to be a narrative that you're reading? Is it an argument? Is it an expository piece of writing? Looking at that title, we can really break that down. Take, for example, A Change of Heart About Animals by Jeremy Rifkin. So if we think of this title, we could think about what words stand out. So one is animals, because I know animals, that is a noun, right? This specifically being worded about animals, that's telling me that animals is the subject. So if I'm thinking about this, I can think of, okay, what animals could they be talking about? And of course, why a change of heart? If I think of the wording change, that is implying that we're thinking or we're feeling one way about animals, and then now this article is wanting us to feel another way or think another way. So that is implying that this is an argument. So as I go into reading this, I'm looking for the argument that's being made. I'm looking for specifically how this author is trying to change how we feel about animals. The other way that we can pre-read is by thinking of the author. Most times when we encounter a reading, it's not anonymously written. There are, of course, cases, especially if it's a published newspaper article or an online article, it might be a staff writer, and that would be fairly anonymous. But for the majority of readings, we do have a set author. So when we have that author, we can think about what else has he, she, or they written. So looking at their publication history can really tell us about where that author is coming from, what they have experience in, and what they're passionate about. Because, of course, if a writer has written about a subject numerous times, that's really telling about what we can anticipate within the reading that we're engaging in. Another way we can think about the author for pre-reading is thinking about their background. So where is that author coming from? What is their educational or occupational, or even like what generation they come from? This can tell us a lot about the experiences that authors had, and of course their biases that go into it and really can lend to what stance they're going to be presenting. Next, we can think about the date of publication. So the date can really help us to figure out what was going on during the time period in which the reading was written, because of course this can inspire the reading, or of course the reading, it could be in response to a specific event. We can think of the publication, and that can really help us figure out who is the audience. And of course, based on who that audience is, that can really lend to how that article is being presented, and of course, why it's being presented and why that information is important for that audience. And lastly, we can skim for words or subheadings. This can really guide us into the specific concepts that are going to be addressed. Subheadings in particular can really help guide us into the organization of the reading that we're going to be engaging in. The second step of this process is annotating. This is where we're engaging with the reading and marking up the margins. So of course, with annotating, the biggest thing for marking up the margins is we should always have some type of visual record of our reading process. So whatever it is we're reading, right, we are writing on top of it so that we can really see what inspired the responses that we are making. So of course, we have a number of different annotating strategies, and using a variety of different strategies actually makes the reading even more effective, especially because it shows the connections that we're making. So when we're annotating, we can underline and or highlight key phrases or passages. We can define words that you don't know or define concepts in your own words. Using definition with annotating is really important because, of course, it helps you to either learn a new word or to increase understanding, because studies have shown that when you put ideas into your own words, you're going to be more likely to not only remember them, but also understand them. With our annotating, we could add our questions, add our examples, our comments, our current concerns, our disagreements, or our rebuttals, so that when we're using that reading later on, we can see and we can identify specifically where we're having or making those comments. Similar to our note-taking strategies that we talked about, our last strategy for this presentation is creating an annotation key. So creating an annotation key is actually really helpful, especially if you don't have a lot of space to annotate because the margins are really small, or if you have the same types of annotations that you're making over and over again. So with an annotation key, we have a symbol and then we have the meaning for that symbol. So when you're annotating, you can use shorthands to mark where you have that comment and then you know later on when you're looking back what that meant. For instance, when we're talking about argumentation, arguments have claims. So if you identify a claim, you can write a C next to it. If there's a part that was confusing, you can use a question mark to indicate that it's confusing. You can write an X if you disagree or you don't like something. Or similarly, you can do a check mark if you understand something or if you agree with something. Or you can even chart and annotate based on your emotional responses, especially if you're annotating a narrative. For instance, you can do a sad face if something made you sad or it appealed to your emotions in a negative way. The nice thing about using an annotation key is you can customize it for whatever reading you're engaging with, as well as add more if you need to make a different type of annotation. Our third and final step of our critical reading strategies process is responding or reflecting. So this is really focusing on working towards assignments and essays. So really when it comes to responding or reflecting, we want to take 10 or 15 minutes to write a brief response or reflect on what you've read. Taking this time really can help us to wrap up that whole reading process and make sure that we didn't lose any ideas or thoughts that we had before we move on to another class or another assignment. So in responding, we can respond in a paragraph about what you agreed or disagreed with, or what you would add to the reading, what was maybe forgotten or left out. With reflection, you can focus on what stood out to you about the reading, did you enjoy it or not, and of course why, and really having that written record. One really great aspect of taking this step in this process is whenever you're referring to that reading later, either in a discussion or more moving towards that essay, having that written record is a really great way of jogging your memory. So you can just reread it and then remember what you thought about it or remember what it was about if we wanted to present a summary in your own words. And then it saves you time, you don't have to reread the article.